From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
We've got our next authors here. Cynthia and Sanford Levinson are married and have teamed up not only in holy matrimony, but also to write a book. Together they have written Fault Lines in the Constitution, The Framers, Their Fights, and the Flaws That Affect Us Today. As its title suggests, the book connects true stories of the writing of the Constitution of the United States to real present-day issues. The book draws upon the knowledge of both authors. Cynthia Levinson has written extensively about history and historical figures in her books for children and young adults, and Sanford Levinson has written about constitutional law and history as a lawyer and professor at the University of Texas Law School. My understanding is that Fault Lines in the Constitution is fresh off the press. Fresh off the press, Fault Lines in the Constitution was published yesterday?
Yes, that's exactly right.
September 1st, yesterday. Let's give a round of applause to our authors. That is amazing. I would also like to bring to your attention to the blog that the Levinsons wrote to accompany Fault Lines in the Constitution. If you're interested in further reading, you can find it at faultlinesintheconstitution.com. You can also meet both of our authors later for a book signing. So, in book signing, just to remind everybody, the book signings are down to my left, which will be your audience right. Without further ado, let me introduce Cynthia and Sanford Levinson.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't see where I am. Is this... No? Okay, I have to go back one. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that there was... Yep, thank you. Oh, that's where it is. Okay. So, our very kind introducer just mentioned that this book is fresh off the press. He also mentioned a blog that we're doing. We're blogging every 2 weeks about this book to keep it updated. And in keeping with that urgency, he mentioned that this is very current. We have just changed this morning our presentation for you. We're going to include some of the slides that we had been planning to include, but we're beginning differently than we had initially thought we would because of current events. This young woman, whom you see here, is named Lesia Dalla. Lesia now lives in Washington, D.C. She grew up in San Antonio, Texas, but she was born in Canada. She came with her family to this country when she was 6 years old. She graduated from school in San Antonio. She graduated from Northwestern University. She got jobs. What she didn't know was, until she was about to graduate from college, was that her family had overstayed their visas in the United States. Lesia has been living here as an undocumented alien since she was a senior in college. Now, we're not tattling on Lesia. Lesia opens Chapter 4 in Fault Lines in the Constitution. And the reason she does that, and she graciously allowed us to use her story, to tell her story, is that her situation is very closely related to the Constitution. What makes her story especially urgent now, and the reason we decided to open with her, is that there is speculation that the president is going to end a program that has allowed her to stay and work here. That is a program that was handed down, was an executive order handed down by President Obama in 2012, the DACA program, Deferred Action for Children of Aliens. But there is possibility, the president has suggested that he might be ending that program. Her situation is integrally involved in problems with the U.S. Constitution. And I'm going to turn it to Sandy to let him explain how.
Okay, so how does this relate to the Constitution, and why does this take up a chapter in our book? The answer goes back to December 2010, when the House passed legislation that would have legalized or normalized the presence in the United States of children brought into the United States by their parents, and would have given them basically a safe haven in the United States. Congress is bicameral, and we spend a great number of pages in our book on the fact that Congress consists of two separate houses. So getting through the House wasn't good enough. It has to go through the Senate. What happened in the Senate? Well, as a matter of fact, a majority of the Senate, with members from both parties, supported the so-called DREAM Act bill. But a majority isn't good enough, thanks to Rule 22 of the Senate, that requires a supermajority in order for bills to come up to a vote. So the key vote in the Senate in December of 2010 was whether or not to go forth with the legislation. The vote was 55 to 45. You might think that in a country that calls itself a democracy, that would be good enough to go to a vote. Well, it isn't, because Rule 22 says you have to have 60 votes, and 60 is more than 55, obviously. This can be traced back to an obscure but important part of the Constitution that gives each House of Congress the ability to set its own rules. And so one of the rules the Senate has established is to require a supermajority to get a vote. We also actually begin the very first chapter in the book with a story about lynching. In 1921, Warren Harding, a Republican president, with the cooperation of a Republican congressman from St. Louis, introduced an anti-lynching bill in the House. It ultimately didn't pass because of the filibuster of white Southern Democrats in the Senate. And this was true throughout the next several decades. And we still don't have a federal anti-lynching bill, though fortunately we either don't have lynchings since the 1950s or basically don't have them. But we should have had an anti-lynching bill in 1921, and we didn't have it because of this same feature of the Constitution.
So both of these are examples, one from Chapter 1 and one from Chapter 4, in which the majority of the legislators and the majority of the population wants a particular law, but for various reasons, because of entrenchment in the Constitution, they cannot pass, which is frustrating for everybody. These are two examples of how our book, Fault Lines in the Constitution, differs from other books about the Constitution. Most other books walk through the Constitution in order, article by article, explaining how our government works. We do believe that, to some large extent, our government does work. We are not thoroughgoingly against our Constitution. It has survived for, come September 17th of this year, 230 years. On the other hand, there are very, very fundamental problems with our Constitution. Some of them having to do with what's been there all the way through, and some of them having to do with obsolescence, which we'll tell you a little bit about. So our book focuses on problems within the Constitution.
Can I?
Yeah.
That many of the parents here might be familiar with civics courses that talk about how a bill becomes a law. And one of the things that makes our book different in some ways is that we focus on why it is that most bills never become laws. And the DACA bill, the DREAM Act bill, or the anti-lynching bill are only two of a number of examples. It's also true that most modern courses on the Constitution, especially since World War II, focus on constitutional rights. Constitutional rights are important. We like rights. That being said, we also think that it's very, very important for people who really are going to understand our system to understand the structures of government that often make it very difficult, in fact, to enact legislation that would enable people to enjoy their constitutional rights.
And I mentioned two other ways in which our book is different from other books about the Constitution, especially for young readers. One is that we give examples from other countries and from state constitutions where some of the problems with ours are avoided or worked around. So we're not completely hopeless. We provide ways to ameliorate the situation, to improve things. And also, in the end of the book, we grade the Constitution. Spoiler alert, it does not get an A. In fact, it doesn't even get a B. Now, every test, a lot of young people here take tests. There are measures for tests. You're tested against something, there's an expectation. So we have expectations for the Constitution, but they're not just ours. They were the founding fathers, they were the framers' expectations, which are written into the preamble. So here are the tests, the measures, the standards, the rubrics for the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
Establish justice.
Ensure domestic tranquility.
Provide for the common defense.
Promote the general welfare.
And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So you might think about the two examples we just gave of issues in the Constitution. How well does the Constitution or the preamble hold up, given those issues, and also a couple of others that we're about to talk about. One that you are probably very familiar with here in Washington, D.C. We expected applause at this point, yes, that's right. Taxation without representation. Who wants that? This is Chapter 6 in Fault Lines Without, what do we call it? Fault Lines in the Constitution. That's the name of our book. And this comes straight out of the Constitution.
Right. Congress, in fact, is required to carve out a certain territory for the U.S. Capitol. And those of you who might be fans of the play Hamilton know that it's here and not elsewhere because of a deal that was struck in the room where it happened between Hamilton and Jefferson. But Washington, like Puerto Rico, which we also discussed briefly, is not a state. And that means that you have no representation in Congress, which means that the federal taxes that are imposed on you, you have no say in. It also means that the local taxes that you might have some say in through the Washington City Council are ultimately under the control of Congress. So this really doesn't look like what most people in the 21st century would think a democratic self-government is all about.
So you'll be glad to know that you all, those of you who live in the district anyway, are well represented in this book, even if you're not well represented in Congress. Thank you. And I should thank our son-in-law, by the way, because he made a strong case for including that chapter. So another thing that you might not expect in a book about the Constitution is a graphic. These graphics are from the book about corn syrup. Now, why is there a graphic on corn syrup in a book on the Constitution? Well, corn syrup is in a lot of products. In fact, when Sandy and I were flying down here on American Airlines, we were handed a package of mini pretzels, and Sandy looked at the ingredients. Yep, corn syrup right here in a package of pretzels. Who needs corn syrup and pretzels? It's in muffins, it's in ketchup, it's in soft drinks. Corn syrup just pervades our diet, and it's not healthy. That's the other thing. Corn syrup is deteriorating Americans' health, especially young people, in fact. It is very likely that there are corn products in the carpeting right here and in the seat cushions that you're sitting on. Why is this the case? This also relates to the Constitution.
Right. The United States Senate, as the result of what is often called the Great Compromise, but you should know that James Madison detested this compromise and described it as a lesser evil. The decision in 1787 was to give each state the same voting power in the Senate. It's very, very different from the House of Representatives. This means that the states that grow corn, although they have a very small percentage of the population, have significant power in the Senate. And because the agriculture industry is what most senators, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, it really doesn't matter. They're representing their constituents faithfully and honestly. They're sent to Washington to get federal funds for local agricultural interests, including corn. So the Senate is a tribute to what we would call malapportionment. We like to think that we believe in the principle one person, one vote in this country. We don't. And the Senate is the best example, and it has consequences as revealed in how it is we spend so much money on encouraging people to grow corn and corn syrup.
Right. And as you can see from this graphic from the book, less than half the population in the United States is represented by 82% of the Senate, whereas more than half the population is represented by only 18 senators. The story that begins the chapter in which we talk about the Senate and this inequity tells the story of the Patriot Act, which gave more money per capita to small states which had less chance of being attacked by future terrorist attacks than large states like New York, Massachusetts, California, and that sort of thing. That chapter refers to the upside-down math of the Patriot Act. It's really the upside-down math of the U.S. Senate. So, Sandy and I wrote this book together. As our introducer said, I write for young people. He writes for older people.
Largely academics.
Yes, largely academics, that's right, and college and graduate students. We wrote the book in one voice, that is, as if one person is telling the story, until the last chapter, where we hold a debate with each other, going back and forth. And here's the picture of the two of us recording our debate with each other for the audio version of the book. The debate is about what do we do now. As I said, we don't leave you hopeless. We give you examples of how to do things better, and we also talk about ways to change the Constitution. From my perspective, I think we should go through the amendment process, even though the second to last chapter of the book features the difficulty of amending the Constitution. Sandy's approach, however,
yes, is to call for a new constitutional convention, as in fact Article 5 allows, but has never been done. In our comparative approach, we show that almost all other constitutions, not only around the world, who really cares about other national constitutions, unfortunately, but also within the United States, are easier to amend than the US Constitution. So if we are seriously to confront the kinds of issues that face us, my own view is ultimately that we need a new constitutional convention as envisioned by the framers. We do not engage in founder bashing. They did the best they could in 1787. The question raised in our book is what we do in 2017 and the future with regard to responding to what we should recognize are the fault lines And the title does come from geology and the possibility that tectonic plates that generally you could ignore every now and then will create catastrophic earthquakes. And we should try to anticipate that before it happens rather than wait until the catastrophe comes.
Well, I don't disagree with that. It's just that, if you have a constitutional convention, everything is up for grabs. But we won't go through the debate right now. You could, read that in there. But I do want to go back. We do want to go back to, remember the preamble? Here's the crib sheet on the preamble for, for the test. So we ask you all to think about what you think. To what extent do you think the Constitution meets its goals? I see we have only 5 minutes left. We want to remind you also about the blog, as our introducer did, because we are keeping the book updated every couple of weeks. Do you want to add anything before we turn to questions?
No, I would love to hear some questions or comments.
So yes, we would love to know your thoughts about the preamble, the Constitution, the writing, whatever you'd like to bring up. It's a little hard to see. Oh, I think we must have answered every single question. Well, oh, wait, no, is that somebody? I think we have a question.
Good.
Or somebody's leaving. I can't quite tell. I don't want to embarrass anybody.
No, there is a question.
Oh, okay. Oh, so the question is, I sort of gave it away that we don't give the Constitution an A or a B in our research. What state or other country does get an A? To tell you the truth, we didn't grade other constitutions, in part because other constitutions don't have the preamble. Our, the U.S. Constitution preamble, and that's the measure. Also, frankly, we sort of cherry pick. So we don't look at other constitutions wholesale. We look at aspects of other constitutions that do a better job in particular areas than ours does. For instance, we have an example we were going to use, except we decided to talk about Lesia Dalla instead, about continuity in government and what to do, and habeas corpus, complicated issues, but interesting to children still, about what to do in case of epidemics or devastating floods. We live in Texas, so please think of the Gulf Coast right now. And we give an example from the South African Constitution, which does address more effectively than our 1787 Constitution does what to do in cases of attacks and that sort of thing.
I think it's also the case that inevitably the answer to that question is going to be a function about what is it that most worries you right now. If in fact you thought the Constitution was working reasonably well, you'd give it a B or a B plus, and you thought there were ways to make it even better, then you might focus, say, on Article 5, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to amend the Constitution, and you might look at one of the other constitutions within the country or around the world that is easier to amend. It's no secret, though, that today, that is, this very day, there's a great deal of discussion about President Trump and his own continuity in office. If we had a parliamentary system, he could be voted out of office with a vote of no confidence. We don't. If we were California, then there could be a recall election. But we don't have that.
And we'll be glad to talk, sorry, but our very patient person is standing here giving us the high sign.
Right.
So we'll be glad to talk more about these things afterwards or, when we're signing books. So,
I just want to say
oh,
thank you, because there's finally, with your book, there's finally a book about current issues that relates directly to the history of the country for us to read with our children. Because the best way to affect change in the future is through our children. And as an immigrant myself, I know I don't look like, I mean, I blend in with America because I'm from Canada, but I have a lot of immigrant friends who don't blend in the way I do because they look different, they sound different, and it's a major issue for a lot of us. So thank you for bringing that awareness up again, and hopefully it creates a dialogue between American families. So just thank you. I appreciate that.
And thank you for your heartfelt concern. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
More questions? Or?
Oh, do we have time? Oh, hello. Do we have time?
So if I was able to...
Sorry.
I was able to wave a magic wand and give you the opportunity to change one thing in the Constitution, what is it you would choose and how would you go about it?
Okay, I've got two. I'm sorry, Marty, I've got two things. One is, I think, having worked with Sandy on this book, my two least favorite parts of the Constitution actually are the Senate and the Electoral College. Sandy, what about you?
Well, I mean, as I said it really a moment or two ago, asking me this question today, given what I have to admit, it's no secret, you could Google me, are my views about President Trump, I would prefer that there were an alternative to impeachment or the 25th Amendment, neither of which works effectively. But on other days, I might very well give you different answers. I certainly agree with Cynthia that the Electoral College has long since outlived its time. I share James Madison's view that the Senate is an evil, and I think it's no longer a necessary evil. But what concerns me most today is the power that the president has and the fact that there's really not much we can do about it, in contrast with many other political systems across the world, and for that matter, in several of the American states.
I think I see more questioners, but I don't know if we have time.
I'll take questions as long as...
No, I'm seeing head shaking. No time. Okay. Come talk to us afterwards.
Right.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.